There's a park in New York City in the northern tip of Manhattan. It's called Inwood Hill Park, and on first glance, it doesn't seem like much. Just another green splotch on a map, an escape from the concrete jungle. But there's something different about Inwood Hill Park, because if you pay attention, you'll see something that no other public park in New York City has. Living, breathing archaeology. To understand why Inwood Hill Park is unique, we need to go back to its roots, its prehistoric roots. Thousands of years ago, shifting glaciers crack and split what is now Inwood into fragments, creating ravines, valleys, and importantly, caves. Over time, a large forest, now the last natural one in Manhattan, forms next to a salt marsh. Today, it's a reminder of the tidal marshes that once surrounded the island. But that combination of a temperate climate, lush vegetation, and a thriving ecosystem thanks to the marshes means that this place is perfect for human occupation. Millennia later, Inwood Hill Park sees its first human inhabitants, the Lenape Native Americans. Wedged right between the Hudson and Harlem rivers, Inwood is an ideal location for a seasonal camp. They fish, hunt, build, and find shelter in Inwood, leaving behind artifacts that amateur archaeologists centuries later will unearth. And it's the activity during this time period, around the 17th century, that places Inwood on the map, or at least our maps, because soon after, European colonists take over. Records show that it's a relatively peaceful takeover, and considering that Inwood was only a seasonal camp, it's hard to imagine that this particular transaction is exceptionally harmful to the Lenape. Under the Europeans during the Revolutionary War, Inwood is transformed into a military base. The area thankfully doesn't see much bloodshed and over the years develops into a quiet, peaceful residential area. The year is 1890 when an engineer named Alexander Chenoweth stumbles upon an interesting rock formation, not far from his house. Huge, slab-like stones piled on top of one another. In the coming weeks, he digs beneath these rocks, uncovering pottery sherds, stone tools, and remnants of campfires. The stones, he concludes, are in fact an ancient cave system once inhabited by the Lenape. And that brings us to today. A simple online search of Inwood Hill Park reveals that its most popular attraction are the caves, labeled Indian Caves. Visitors to the park don't have to walk too far or search long and hard. You can find them right off of one of the main paths. And when you arrive, you'll notice that these caves aren't really caves at all, but merely hollowed out burrows underneath these stones. They're more akin to crawl spaces than actual habitations. Now, the underwhelming nature of these caves shouldn't be reason to dismiss their historical importance. However, superficial history and bad archaeology can lead us down incorrect conclusions. The name Indian Caves, without any context or background information, none of which is provided in the park itself, creates a narrow yet vague definition that these caves belonged to Native Americans. This, combined with destructive archaeology that strips away all context from the scene, sets a precedent that Native Americans in the 17th century mostly lived in these naturally formed rudimentary shelters, that we owe the current infrastructure built in Inwood and around the New York area solely to the Europeans who settled after. This form of tourism forgets the wigwams, longhouses, and intricate compounds created by the Lenape. It ignores the problematic archaeology of the area and dilutes historical truth. It erroneously sets up these conflicting cultures as stark contrasts: primitive Native Americans to advanced Europeans. In reality, this is harmful, not only to the Lenape and their descendants, but to the general public's overall perception of the violent and whitewashed history of American genocide. It sets us up to believe that the cultures and peoples lost had overall little effect on the country, that the new wave of Europeans with superior technology and smarter infrastructure ultimately pushed America in the right direction. Maybe that is the case, because it's easy to say, what if, but hard to come to meaningful conclusions. But shallow history and inadequate archaeology will only propagate biased narratives. With Columbus Day celebrated every year, we don't have to look too far to see what happens when we choose to ignore nuanced history. And that's precisely why Inwood Hill Park is so important. Not just because it's home to an active archaeological site, but also because it serves as a reminder that the key to deciphering the past and ultimately grappling with the present is context, context, context.